Today's Deeper Dive with Dara Cam podcast is brought to you by the Lockwood Law Firm. The firm, founded by John Lockwood, is based in Tallahassee, Florida, and its attorneys have more than 40 years of combined experience in legal and regulatory policy matters. The Lockwood Law Firm specializes in the alcoholic beverage, cannabis, casino gaming, and healthcare industries. Visit lockwoodlawfirm.com for more information or to set up a consultation. Today I have a triple treat for you. We've got almost a century, or probably a century's worth of journalism experience in the room right here with me, City and State Florida Editor-in-Chief Jim Rosica, and special guest Bill Cotterell, who is now a columnist for City and State Florida, who began his reporting days back in the 1960s. Stick with us. Bill Cotterell coming right up.
And I really think the overriding bias, is in favor of a good story.
You're listening to A Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by City and State Florida.
Hello and welcome to A Deeper Dive with me, Dara Cam. I have two special guests with me today here in the Terracotta Room at the News Service of Florida / City and State HQ in downtown Tallahassee. They are my regular mook, the two mooks, City and State Editor-in-Chief Jim Rosica. Just rolls right off the tongue.
Make sure that she remembers the name.
Rolls right off the tongue. I got the title correct that time, and I screwed up on the name, but that's okay because I also have Bill Cotterell. Bill Cotterell, I would say, is the Dean of the Florida Press Corps. He is going to tell us how long he's been journalizing in Tallahassee. He used to have a column called The Capitol Curmudgeon in the Tallahassee Democrat. He's worked for Wire Services. He now is a columnist for City and State Florida. Welcome to A Deeper Dive, Bill Cotterell.
Thank you for inviting me.
You've been around for a minute. How long have you been reporting the news in a period? Just how long have you been a reporter?
Well, I started in 1966 with United Press International, the wire service, which is pretty much gone now. The Associated Press is the dominant news wire. And I came to Tallahassee in 1969.
And have you been here that whole time, or was there a period of time when you...
No, in 1974, UPI asked me to go to Atlanta because the governor up there was going to run for president, and they didn't want to waste one of their Washington experts on a guy who had no chance. So I wound up schlepping around the country for about 18 months or so with Jimmy Carter. And he went to Washington, and I came back to Tallahassee in the late 70s.
The wisdom of the powers that be, the wisdom of the news editors.
Well, I wish I could claim to have spotted him as an early prospect, but I agreed with the conventional wisdom. In fact, one time at a social gathering, when he was still governor, he asked a few of the reporters what we thought of him running for president. And I said, well, I think you'll see a lot of the country and have a lot of fun, but I don't think you're going to wind up in the White House. And 2 years later, as president-elect, he had a news conference to appoint the Attorney General, Griffin Bell, and he saw the press corps in a roped-off area, and he came over and said hello to some of the old guys, and when he got to me, he said, well, I had a lot of fun and saw a lot of the country. And I thought, wow, he remembered.
That's terrific. That's a great story. Bob Graham used to be that kind of, he used to have that kind of memory. He wrote everything down in that little book, and former governor of Florida and former U.S. senator from Florida who probably half the people listening to this don't have no idea who he
Well,
was.
I said to Graham one time something about you had just finished a speech to the, it was like 12 years previously. I said, you had just finished talking to the Florida Association of School Superintendents. He said, school boards. I said, oh. And I didn't go look it up and check it, but I'll bet he was right.
Yeah, he probably was. Well, so you've been doing this for 5 decades now. What are the biggest stories that you covered?
I think, well, Jim and I were both here for the wonderful election of 2000. And
So
you were
was
here.
I, yeah.
Yes. I loved it. I thought, I hope we'll never have another normal election. Winning the presidency by 537 votes and people demonstrating in the streets and people in the Supreme Court making arguments. I thought it's a great way to decide the presidency.
I worked for the Associated Press at the time. I worked 8 80-hour weeks in a row because I was doing broadcast shift. Sometimes I was working overtime. I had 1 day off in that 8-week period, which was quite the. I was just thinking, the three of us in this room, we probably have a century of journalism
Easily.
experience between the three of us. What were the stories that moved you the most over the years? Because I know I can give you mine. I'll tell you mine first. Well, I'll give you a minute to think about it. Same-sex marriage. I covered a lot of the litigation, the Florida case, challenging Florida's ban on same-sex marriage. And I was here in Tallahassee at the courthouse on the day that they first started issuing same-sex marriage licenses. Saw a couple of ceremonies that same day near the courthouse, speaking to people. I knew that I was witnessing history. It was the same as the recount in the way that you knew that this was a moment in history that would be recorded. But this was a much different kind of story. There were people, there was emotion, there were tears, there was love, there was joy. And that, I think, is the moment, I think, that moved me the most as a journalist, witnessing history.
Mine was more episodic. I don't think it didn't change a lot of people's lives. Didn't change the law, but I would say Hurricane Andrew down in Miami in 1990. What would that have been? 92. But just the Katrina, of course, became much worse later, but that wasn't in Florida. And I grew up in Miami, and I was familiar with much of the terrain down there and just the incredible devastation. I always thought growing up a hurricane was, 3 feet of water in the street, and you couldn't, schools were shut down, grocery stores. But the horrible devastation and the way people's lives were changed. People left, had to leave South Florida and probably never came back, many of them. And of course, the demographics of the area, when I grew up there in the 50s, it was much different in Miami. There wasn't as large a Cuban population. The culture had changed. There weren't as many elderly people. And of course, I was a little kid. Closed the schools for a week, great.
Right.
But I was shocked by that and terribly impressed. Never really forgot it.
I covered Katrina from Biloxi, and Biloxi was a complete. There were blocks and blocks of rubble. That was a natural disaster I'll never forget too. How about you, Rosica? What's the story that moved you the most in your reporting career?
I don't know. Well, actually, the story that moved me the most, I remember covering the killing of a police officer here in Tallahassee and I remember covering that trial, and there was some question as to whether I actually looked this guy up on the Department of Corrections database recently, and I don't know why I started thinking about him. He's obviously still in custody.
Was that Officer Ponce?
No, that was actually Dale Green.
Dale Green.
And the perp was a man named Coy Evans, and there was I remember there being some question as to whether he was going to get the death penalty, and the judge who presided over the case, who is now retired from the bench and whose name I won't remember, of course, but I do remember him giving a very long explanation before he announced the sentence, explaining why he wasn't going to give the death sentence. And he went over a lot of his own personal biographical information and his own history, and talking about how he was before he was a judge, he was a lawyer, and after that he was an assistant prosecutor, but he was also an assistant public defender. And I just remember going through that process of a murder trial, from jury selection to verdict to sentencing, and it was a very it was a crime that very much captured the attention of this community, obviously, and I literally had a front row seat for the whole thing. So to the point where, again, I don't know why I thought of this guy a couple weeks ago, Coy Evans, who is still in the custody of the Department of Corrections, obviously. I just
Wow.
and it struck me because I looked at his current photo in the DOC website, and I said, "Yep, that doesn't look like the person I remember sitting in a courtroom however many years ago." So we've all gotten older. But that's the in answer to your question, that would be the case.
So 3 reporters, 3 very different top of mind stories. That's great. So question's a little obvious, but I'd like your insight into how reporting has changed since you first started in the business almost 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago. Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
the immediacy, I think, both a good and a bad thing. I mean, the medium we're working in right now didn't exist.
Sure.
20 years ago, 15, I don't know. But yesterday on Facebook, somebody posted a picture of the old Floridan Hotel on Monroe Street. It's an old South, had archways, a big veranda. And it caused me, I made a comment on Facebook that the press corps in the old days, back in the 50s, 40s, by about noon, they'd go down to the Floridan, have lunch, sit on the veranda, drink, I'm sure, tell stories, socialize, and state officials, if somebody was announcing for governor or something, they would go down 3 blocks to the Floridan, where the Aloft Hotel is now, and the PR men would bring press releases to the
On paper, kiddies.
to the veranda of the hotel.
Oh, wow.
The all-white, almost all-male
Right.
press corps would decide whether this is worth stirring and doing some work.
Moving off the porch.
Yeah. And now, of course, we're all online and we can tweet something instantly. And it's both good and bad because a lot of nonsense, a lot of errors get circulated that way. But I think it's also good because, you can't keep a secret. The former speaker, Ralph Haben, told me a little while ago, he said about these texting and handheld, little phones. He said it used to be you could go to the governor's mansion, work something out, and get back to the Capitol when he was speaker. Would have been 80 to 82. And you could snooker somebody or work out an amendment on a bill. And by the time the House convenes at 10 a.m., have the bill ready, the amendment, and do the deed. He said now with texting
Right.
and FaceTime, he said you can't get from the governor's mansion to the Capitol before the secret's leaked.
Yeah, you can't get from the governor's office to the fourth floor, probably.
Right.
So the immediacy is one thing that's changed. Certainly the media have changed.
Oh, yes.
The fact that we're podcasting here, the internet itself was something that you didn't have back in the day.
And I think that better educated reporters, more worldly and less prejudiced. I remember when in 1973 the Supreme Court struck down the old sodomy statute, and a couple of gay men, I don't know if they were a couple or didn't even know each other, but two gay men came up and admitted at a Judiciary Committee meeting that they were gay and that they thought the state of Florida could just leave them alone. We did not need a law to interfere in their lives. And I remember the reporters nudging each other and pointing, see those guys over there? You know, those guys are queer.
Right.
You know? And it was like they had leprosy or something.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling bad for them. I can't say I was so enlightened that I took their side or
Right,
anything.
that you chided your colleagues or anything.
At the same time, I thought, you know, it must take an awful lot of nerve to publicly identify. And the state did pass a law, the Senate passed a law. The old law had forbidden what was called the abominable and detestable crime against nature.
Wow.
And the Supreme Court said that's too vague. People might not know if they're being abominable and detestable. So the Senate passed a bill, and senators were catcalling. There was an Alka-Seltzer commercial at the time that had a tagline, "Try it, you'll like it." And they were calling out things like that. The Senate President, Mallory Horn, removed the pages. The teenagers, he sent them over to a committee room.
Because this was too raunchy for
That was
their
1973.
virgin ears.
And the House Speaker, Dick Pettigrew, told the clerk to take the official copy, the bound in blue paper with a ribbon and the state seal on it, take the official copy of the bill and lock it in a drawer. He said the House is not going to take this up.
Wow.
Because he said if the learned elders of the Senate can be reduced to giggling schoolboys,
Right.
the kids and the juveniles in the House, Lord knows what they would do. And in the last 2-3 days of the session, he let the session expire without taking up the sodomy bill, which nowadays I don't think would even be controversial if the Supreme Court made such a ruling.
I don't know. I mean, I think 5 years ago maybe it wouldn't be controversial, but maybe now in this kind of post-Victorian, I'm not even sure what to call it. I'm calling it like a post-Victorian era, but I think we might.
Moms for Liberty would be up here railing against.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting story to think about how far culturally we have evolved over.
And the press was that way too. They were men and women, mostly men, of the 1930s. They'd grown up in segregation and they had accepted, they weren't evil men themselves, but they just accepted a culture that was that way.
Right.
And these new things of like, you know, the first black homecoming queen at FSU was a big story.
Was that something that you were around for?
Yeah, and streaking.
Oh, streaking. In case you don't know what streaking is. Young people might not know what streaking is.
I keep forgetting.
Streaking was a fad where people would run naked through campus or through whatever.
And it started at FSU.
Did it?
Yeah.
Streaking has its roots in FSU. See, I knew Bill Cotterell, font of knowledge here.
Well, another little quick story.
Sure. That's why you're here.
The Florida Flambeau was tipped off that these three guys were going to jump out of a car, run across Landis Green, and be picked up by a car on the other side. So they had a photographer and a reporter. They interviewed the guys, and they told me about it, told the UPI Bureau. And I wrote a little story, and it moved on the National Wire And like 2 days later, college kids all over America were streaking. So many years later, Bob Woodward of the Washington Post came and spoke here in Tallahassee at Capitol Tiger Bay. And I met him, and it just occurred to me, I said, you spent 1973 getting Nixon. I said, I got college kids, my story got college kids to run around naked for a few days. I said, I think our contribution to the culture is about even. And Woodward said, yeah, I'll give you that one.
What was the purpose of streaking? Was it just to
They were
get
college
attention?
kids.
They just were college.
When you were a college kid, you probably did something. And Ellen Goodman, the Boston Globe columnist, I remember did a column saying, every generation wants to shock your parents. And how did you shock parents in the early 70s? You went to Woodstock,
Yeah.
you streaked,
You
called Nixon
tuned in and
unprintable
dropped
names.
out.
Yeah. Yeah, you smoked pot.
Right. Well, so we've talked a little bit about how reporting has changed over the years. I mean, we're still using our little I have a reporter notebook. I still use it, but you see mostly people
Sure.
holding up their phones to get quotes. What are your thoughts about some of how journalism has changed? I've been having a lot of questions from my neighbors about anonymous sources. What are your thoughts about anonymous sources? And then I want to ask Rosica that same question too as an editor.
I would be extremely reluctant or cautious about that. The editor should know. I believe during Watergate, Ben Bradley knew who Deep Throat was, and Carl Bernstein didn't. He was Woodward's source, but the top editor must know and must make a decision of, well, is this person a reliable person in a high enough position to know what he's talking about, he or she? And even then, I would use it very, very sparingly, and I think we should tell the reader. I do see this. I see this. Well, no, not who the source is.
No, but I mean, why?
they can't-
Why?
Yeah. And I see it commonly. They'll say, blah, 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 said someone who spoke on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized. I mean, this weekend we had the story of cocaine found at the White House, and I think somebody in the Secret Service, some reliable, high-ranking person, was quoted, but it said, for security reasons, the reason they're called secret,
Right.
this person didn't wish to, and then within a couple hours, an official spokesperson for the Secret Service, for the White House, the Uniform Division was quoted by name. But I do think that Donald Trump has contributed to it, but I think the public doesn't trust secret sources. They think we're making it up.
I think that an over-reliance. Well, let me ask Rosica to weigh in here. What do you think about the use of anonymous sources?
I would simply second much of what Bill said, but I do think it helps that I think most major media outlets have adopted the program that Bill talked about, which is if you're going to use anonymous sources, just simply explain why.
I just feel like we see a lot more of it in I don't even know what to call us, like regular journalism that we do, wire stories from legitimate newspapers or media outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times. I just feel like we see a lot more of it now than we used to. I see some whole stories built around, and big stories built around numerous anonymous sources, and I understand people don't want to say some of this stuff out loud. Lobbyists, people close to the administration, people close to campaigns. But I feel like it really does help to undermine our credibility when we are already in a really shaky spot.
So you think that the use of anonymous sources should be out the window at this point?
I don't think it should be out the window. I think it should be much rarer than what it is right now. I just think I think it is in use much too regularly, and I feel like we are in a place as journalists. I'd be interested in what you guys think about this, but I think we are in a spot where we need to win back the faith of Jane and Joe Lunchbucket. We'll be right back with Bill Cotterell, Dean of the Florida Press Corps.
Here at Deeper Dive, we want to hear from you, the listeners. We invite you to send your questions, comments, and feedback to our mailbag. You can reach us at deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. That's deeperdive@cityandstatefl.com. Get your 2 cents in by sending us an email.
Welcome back to A Deeper Dive with Dara.
Well, I'll tell you a brief story about something that happened to me on the 4th of July, where I went to a neighborhood picnic and introduced myself to someone, and he said, "Oh, you're the guy that got Loran Osley kicked out of office."
Wow.
And I think he was half kidding, and of course the background for that, and I think we've discussed it before on this pod.
Let's do it again. It's
on
worth
this podcast.
revisiting.
Back when I was the equivalent of the managing editor for the Tallahassee Democrat, we had, in the middle of the pandemic, we couldn't do in-person candidate forums. So we did online candidate forums, and everybody zoomed in from their home or office. And this is back before this was when Loran the previous election, not the one that she lost to the current Senate
Corey
seat holder, Corey Simon, but when she was running the previous election, we had a candidate forum, and I had what I called a lightning round question, and I asked this to her opponent also. And the question was something along the lines of, is there anybody or any group you won't take a campaign contribution from? And she curtly said, nope. And I said, it took me off guard. And I said, well, you'll take money from anybody? And she said, yep. And of course, then I asked her opponent, who was a Republican, who said, I probably wouldn't take money from Planned Parenthood. And I said, okay, fine. Both had the opportunity to consider the question and answer it. But the problem was that the opponent's campaign then used the excerpt from the forum to make an ad, both that and reuse the quotes, the second election. Apparently there are those in the community who feel as though I inadvertently or not contributed to Loran Osley being voted out of office. Not at all. They
were glad that you had gotten her kicked out of.
I don't know that they were glad. I think they only brought it up kind of half kiddingly.
Right.
But it's just funny that that's the first thing that, like, hey, you're meeting this new person. Oh, you're that guy who dum-dum. And that's the first thing that came to their mind.
Do you get people asking you, about the, taking it for granted that the media has an agenda and that we set the narrative because we have an agenda? I see Bill Cotterell also shaking his head.
Simple answer, yes.
And what about you?
I'm concerned about that. I think that lately with the Hunter Biden laptop thing, I've seen a lot of conservative Fox News people saying, if Donald Trump Jr. or any of the Trump offspring had done things like this, the media would be all over it, as they were when he was president. But that Hunter Biden was getting, I think there's some media reluctance or a desire to give Hunter a break because he was addicted. He had a disease there, a cocaine addiction.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily trying to be politically favorable to his father as much as well, this guy was not himself. He was suffering from addiction. But still the degree, I mean, billion-dollar deals with companies in China and Ukraine. My son was never approached to broker any deals like that. And I think Joe Lunchbucket reader that you refer to legitimately wonders, is the press being fair in its coverage?
Giving differential treatment to the Democrats. I mean, there's an assumption that we're all left-leaning liberals, and I know that that's not true for all of us. I have personally worked with very conservative journalists, and I'm not sure. Look, we're all human beings, and we all have opinions, and we do our best to try to remain balanced and fair. And do our opinions creep in sometimes? Maybe.
And I really think the overriding bias, is in favor of a good story.
Yeah.
Now, most often, lately in the Trump era, a good story has been something the right wing doesn't like, and the left wing might, Obamacare or something like that. The Dobbs decision and abortion, the left might like that better. But if I once jokingly, forgot the context, I said, we might enjoy hurting conservatives, but hurting liberals is better than not hurting anybody at all. And I think, perhaps we'll hate to do it, but we will cover the story that embarrasses the cocaine in the White House, that embarrasses Joe Biden's administration. I think the press will go after that aggressively.
I think there's something that I've been wanting to talk about, and maybe do some sort of training for journalists. And tell me if you think this is something that we need at this point. There's so much I think part of the reasons journalists, the right feels that journalists picked on, I'm using air quotes, Trump, was there was just so much disinformation and misinformation that was coming out of that administration and out of his mouth.
Yeah.
And I feel like we see that here in the Capitol a lot more now than we used to, where people are saying things that just aren't true, questioning the outcome of the election, whether there was fraud or not answering that question, not being willing to say that there was no fraud, that President Biden was legitimately elected. That's just one off the top of my mind. But other things that lawmakers now just will say things that are just not true. There's been this sort of journalism 101, was you give both sides equal time, or you try to give both sides equal time. There's a sense now, though, that you have to fact find when you're doing or there should be, you have to call people out when they're not telling the truth. And so our journalists, how has the work of the onus of responsibility on journalism changed?
I don't remember who said it, but some journalism authority I remember reading said, if one person says it's raining and the other person says it's not raining, the journalist's job isn't to get them both on the air and quote them equally. The journalist's job is to look out the window and find out if it's raining.
Right. So do you think we need more education on that for journalists, or?
Yeah, and less pursuit of clicks or less pursuit of ratings. If Tucker Carlson can get higher ratings by putting somebody on the air who says that the COVID vaccine was hatched in a Chinese lab to track you with a microdot injected into your veins, if he can get higher ratings with somebody saying that, he's going to put that guy on the air.
Right.
And I said Tucker, many,
right. Joe Rogan.
Journalists, yeah.
I don't know, he's not a journalist, but he's a podcaster. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that the onus on us has changed as reporters, or?
I'm reminded of a line from the last season of The Wire in which it's one of the scenes at the fictional Baltimore Sun where the star reporter is making up this story about a serial murderer when it turns out that that's not the case, and he eventually gets found out. But in the early going, there's I think a homeless person who comes into the Baltimore Sun to confront him, and he's there, and the reporter is there, and the crusading city editor is there, who knows that something's up, but he can't prove that his star reporter is lying. And the reporter and the guy get into it, and the reporter is upset that he's not being able to tell his side of the story, and the homeless guy says, "A lie ain't a side of a story, man. A lie's a lie." And so I think that's the position that we're in now in our post-truth or truthiness era. We just as Bill said, it just doesn't, it never should have cut it really to say, A, person A said X and person B said Y, and we'll report and you decide. No, at some point you got to call a lie a lie.
But this isn't new. William Randolph Hearst, 120 years ago, got us into the Spanish-American War. There's a legend, probably true, that he sent a reporter to Havana to stir up stories where the Maine had exploded, this battleship, and the reporter cabled to New York, said, "There's no war here," and the New York Sun was running stories where every day these swarthy Spaniards were raping innocent damsels in Cuba, and we had to get involved. We had to intervene, save these people, and make it a new state, of course. We did get Puerto Rico, but Hearst supposedly wired back to the reporter, "You supply the story, I'll supply the war."
Wow.
And so this stirring up of, the story that gets the clicks and the viewers, gets eyes on the screen.
It ain't new.
120 years ago.
Right. Well, you worked for a local newspaper for the Tallahassee Democrat for many years, the capital paper of the capital city of the third largest state in the country now. Probably was the fourth largest state when you were working there. We see local journalists, local newspapers are now parts of conglomerates. There are a lot of layoffs in our industry. What are your thoughts about the shriveling of local journalism?
I wish I had an answer. Ted Koppel did a piece on CBS Sunday Morning, I believe, just the other day. And I think he said that 2 newspapers a week are either going away completely somewhere in the country, or are going exclusively online only.
Right.
And of course, that with such shrinking staff, there's less and less. One thing I admired about the late Bob Gabordi, who was editor of the Democrat, one time he called a huge staff meeting when we had a bigger staff. And I remember Bob saying, this came down from corporate. We were going to have layoffs. I think it was around 2006.
Yeah, it was
and
a
he
big
said,
year for layoffs.
I think I'm supposed to say we're going to do more with less. And Bob said, no, we're going to do less with less. And
So he was
realistic
like
about it. And I wish I had an answer. People aren't reading. People don't need. We don't need to chop down half of Canada and throw it on your doorstep 18 hours later when you can get it for free on the screen.
Yeah, but the problem is what you're getting for free on the screen sometimes isn't real.
You got no idea.
Right.
I've said in so many columns, I don't know, many times, said don't get your news from Twitter and Facebook and things. You got no idea who puts out little green footballs or some site, Now, if it's the New York Times or the Tallahassee Democrat, at least you know who they are.
Yeah.
And they're in the business of selling news to make money. But you get something, like, excitement.com. I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
That could be the tobacco industry, could be the Southeast Toyota dealers. You got no idea who's behind this site.
Of course, now I'm going to go out and buy the URL, littlegreenfootballs.com.
Well, and then we also have these organs. I'm not even sure what to call them. Maybe you guys have a name for them that are closely tied to Governor Ron DeSantis' administration.
Mm-hmm.
They are getting leaked stuff first. They are publishing pieces that have a decided favorable tilt towards the governor and his allies. Like, what says you about these and I'm calling them organs, which is I don't know really. They're not really news outlets.
I read them, but at least I know, as I think I'm a somewhat informed reader, I know what they are.
But you do, but
Yeah,
does Joe
but
and
that's
Jane
what-
Lunchbucket?
That's what I fear, is that there are a lot of people think they're getting objective news when in fact they're getting, something put out sponsored, whether it's by a corporation or a politician.
We have a sponsor. I just want to say we have a sponsor, John Lockwood Law Firm, the Lockwood Law Firm, but that doesn't have any editorial influence over our conversation. I didn't call up the Lockwood Law Firm and say, hey, is it okay if I have Bill Cotterell on here and here's the questions I'm going to ask him. So I think there's a difference. What says you as an editor, as the editor-in-chief of City and State Florida? Do you feel competition from some of these outlets?
I don't necessarily feel competition. I think I understand them for what they are. I think there's at least one outfit that I think we're pretty sure is bankrolled by people who are close to DeSantis, if not actually involved in the campaign or the super PAC. There's another site that I think is pretty much well known now that it is bankrolled by a conservative businessman down in Southwest Florida. And, I think it's always a matter of disclosure, and some will always want to disclose and most will not, in terms of, here's our bent, here's our editorial bent, here's who we're owned by. And, don't forget that preceding the current news outlets that you're speaking of, there was an outlet called Sunshine State News that was based here in Tallahassee, based in the Florida Press Center, had offices in the Florida Press Center, and to this day, nobody knows for sure who owned them or what the reason for their, what the reason for their existence was. So, we're always going to see these, when you don't need a lot of money to, open up an office and get a printing press and buy paper and ink, when it's just a matter of setting up a website and getting a URL and getting an email service. We're gonna keep seeing these until the end of time, or at least until the end of the internet.
Yeah, really, all you need is the internet and a phone. Essentially, you don't even need a laptop anymore. And the question is, does anybody really care, or are we just, have we, as journalists, outlived our usefulness? I say, nay.
Well, I'm very interested in a story I just saw this morning where some federal judge has directed the White House not to contact
I saw that.
social media. I don't know the details of that yet. I thought good, I'm glad. I don't want the government interfering. But then what do you do?
Well, how do you, what check on disinformation do you have if you're not allowed as an administration to say, hey, this needs to be corrected? I mean, you should be allowed to express your First Amendment right to just correct it. What they do with that, how they handle that pushback. It's very interesting. I haven't read the opinion yet, but I saw the same thing and my eyes kind of goggled.
Yeah. I don't want the government in any way influencing any media, including the new kind of media. But at the same time, I thought, well, if something, I guess the biggest example would be Fox News right after the election. If somebody is deliberately lying to boost ratings, get more viewers, that's damaging the country.
Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. And let me ask you one last question as we've gone down this sort of road to ruin here. What advice would you give young people today looking to get into journalism? Do you think there's a future in it? And if so, what does it look like?
It's online. I mean, I read a story several years, probably 12, 15 years ago, where Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, was asked, will there be a paper New York Times in 20 years? And he said, I don't know. Well, it's been almost 20 years and there is.
Well, there is technically, but I stopped subscribing to the Sunday New York Times several years ago. I still subscribe online, and I don't think you can get it delivered at home anymore on Sunday.
And young people, my son, they get all their information off screens.
Yeah.
And so my advice to young people mainly would be read a wide range of things, read things that upset you, read things that Moms for Liberty want banned. Read everything you can get your hands on with every source, paper, video screen, whatever.
And advice to young journalists?
Yeah, draw from as many sources constantly as possible. I think too many people limit themselves to a few favored, probably because they have lives. They're not retired like me.
Right.
So they have limited time, so they get the 3 or 4 things that confirm their own existing beliefs. And when I was still working at the Democrat, I used to get calls and emails saying, Obama is a Muslim. Some guy in Huntington, Virginia is about to disclose, gonna publish an expose showing that Obama was not born in this country. And I'd say, well, where did you get that? Well, it's all over the internet.
Right.
Well, then it must be true. I mean, if somebody took the time to type it on a keyboard, it must be true.
What about you, Rosica? Got any advice for young journos?
Don't do it. Study STEM. Go into science. If you don't want to go to college, go to a trade school. Learn how to do
air conditioning. Repair, yeah, plumbing,
there you go. That's where the money is. HVAC is the future.
HVAC is the future.
You're in
especially
Florida.
in Florida.
It's all about HVAC.
All right, there you have it. Out of the mouths of the experts here. read, and go to trade school and become and get into the HVAC business. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bill Cotterell. It has been a real treat. I can't wait to have you back on again.
I'd love to come back.
And thank you, Jim Rosica, Editor-in-Chief, City and State, Florida.
And thank you, Dara. And of course, remember Bill Cotterell's column, except for this week, of course, because 4th of July was on a Tuesday. Bill Cotterell's column comes out every Tuesday only on City and State, Florida. That's City and A-N-D, State, FL.com every Tuesday morning. Look for it on your computer.
Oh, I like that.
A Deeper Dive with Dara is a podcast by City and State, Florida, hosted by Dara Cam, produced by Ryan Daly, and music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC, and performed by Ryan Daly and Danny Reyes.
Today's Deeper Dive with Dara Cam podcast is brought to you by the Lockwood Law Firm. The firm, founded by John Lockwood, is based in Tallahassee, Florida, and its attorneys have more than 40 years of combined experience in legal and regulatory policy matters. The Lockwood Law Firm specializes in the alcoholic beverage, cannabis, casino gaming, and healthcare industries. Visit lockwoodlawfirm.com for more information or to set up a consultation.